Brown says, get that India. Big boy.
Call an ambulance! Maybe call a priest! Oh, what a shot! What a shot! Campbell Killer!
Hello and welcome back to a rather special edition of the Tip Sheet podcast. As always, I'm your host, John, also known as 4020. Joining me for a pretty somber podcast is my good mate, Sixties. Big fella, we knew it was coming, and it's the pragmatic decision. It doesn't mean it doesn't sting, but it's not officially official, but the media are treating it as a done deal. Clinton Gutherson released by the Parramatta Eels to join the St George Illawarra Dragons on a 3-year deal that would see him play 25, 26 and 27 in the Red V. Suffice to say, mate, it's the end of an era at the club with this move happening.
Yes, it is, mate. And first of all, good morning to our listeners. We might just be able to get this up in the morning. We are recording early Thursday morning in response to the news coming out yesterday. And it's probably appropriate too to give a shout out to our sponsors, Star Partners Real Estate, Auburn, Narellan and Parramatta. But yes, mate, it was something that we were expecting. And you talk about pragmatic decisions. Had it said to me by a wise bloke that there's a wise rugby league man that there is no room for sentiment in footy contracts. And look, I think it's fair to say that happens both ways in regard to what's happened with Gutho, because Gutho was under contract at Parramatta for next year on what's reported as $950,000 a year. And the Eels weren't prepared to renegotiate his deal right now. And that's within their rights to not do that, because the incoming coach was looking at a change of role, a potential change of role for Gutho. And we don't know how that would have panned out, because it might have been that the preseason unfolded and maybe the new coach might have been uncertain about starting with someone different at fullback. Maybe Gutho might have ended up being at fullback. We just don't know. It's the great unknown about what was going to happen with a new coach and a potential change of role for Gutho. But the Eels weren't prepared to talk contract right now. They wanted to see how things would play out. But from the perspective of Clint Gutherson and his agent, there was obviously something floating around from the Dragons, some interest that couldn't be official, that would have taken his playing contract past 2025. Again, no room for sentiment. He had to do what was best for himself and his family.
Yeah.
And he's been able to secure what looks like a 3-year deal at the Dragons. And, you know, it's rugby league. It's modern day rugby league where players can negotiate from November 1 prior to the year that is their last season. Gutho and his agent requested an early start on that. It means that now the Eels aren't faced with a situation, and Gutho too, where he commences a pre-season and then moves on. There would have been nothing worse for either party than coming and doing a few weeks or a month or two of pre-season and then moving on. This is, as tough as it is, and a result that probably a lot of Parramatta fans are a little bit uncomfortable with, but tough as it may sound, this is probably the best outcome for all parties, because they can make a start as soon as the pre-season begins. Jason Ryles doesn't have to worry about how he's going to work the team around a repositioning of Gutho. He doesn't have to have a situation where Gutho is a leader in the club on the edge of leaving and having all that uncertainty around that. And Gutherson, rather than missing any pre-season time with the Dragons, can start with them from go. And this is all, of course, assuming that everything is finalised today in terms of signing deals and what have you.
And you alluded to it, 60s, but that big contract song and dance that you see in the NRL so often where, sometimes the club is doing a player dirty because they're trying to get out of a contract, or the player undercuts the club and sort of, stabs them in the back and goes elsewhere. Sometimes there is no wrong party. And in this case, I think it's pretty fair to say that the Parramatta Eels are operating pragmatically, but not, without honour. And Gutherson, on the flip side, we know that he's playing with a body that isn't in the best of condition, and it would be very mean to hold that against him and him trying to maximise his value in the next few years as a rugby league player. So it's not like you have to point fingers and say, no, it's the Eels who are wrong, or no, Clinton Gutherson, what's he doing? Why is he not taking a lesser deal at the Parramatta Eels? I think sometimes you can just sit back and say, you know what, it makes sense to both sides.
Yeah, absolutely true, mate. And the thing is, how Gutherson was battling injury was no secret to any supporter, and it was becoming tougher each season. Now, the thing about Clint Gutherson is that he obviously has a high pain threshold, and he is the sort of footballer that leaves nothing in the tank. People have witnessed him putting his body on the line for countless years for the Eels. There always seems to be some sort of niggle that's going on with Gutho. And I guess when you play the way that he does, it is a case, as I said, of putting your body on the line. And when you're then on the wrong side of 30, it just makes it tougher and tougher to ask that of your body. Now, Gutho may well move to the Dragons and give them 3 full years of service. And good luck to him and good luck to them. But it's no secret that Gutho played the latter part of this season with injury. He played the early part of the season with injury. There were weeks where he wasn't able to do the full week of training. And I spoke about this in relation to Gutho's courage, the fact that you couldn't tell him that he wasn't going to play in any given week. He had pride in the jersey. He played for his teammates. You couldn't have asked more, really, of a senior player, a captain, than to play when a lot of other players probably wouldn't have taken the field. And when I look back on Clint Gutherson, besides highlight moments, the thing that I'm going to remember most about him is what I wrote about recently, which is just that toughness. And when you talk about Parramatta players and legend Parramatta players, with regard to toughness, I've got him right up alongside Ray Price, because Pricey would battle injury. And he was renowned for doing things like staying up or, setting an alarm to go off at different intervals during the night so he could ice injuries and make sure that he'd be ready for the next week's game. He'd just reapply ice packs, say, every 2 hours, and doing things like that in an era where looking after injuries wasn't the science that it is today. Pricey used to just go above and beyond to get there on the field. There'd be times where you'd think he's got nothing left in the tank, but he'd find a way. He was almost like a rag doll being lifted up by trainers at times. But he'd find a way to keep battling on. And for him to ever miss a game would be a rarity. And it was really the same with Gutho. It was only the knee reconstructions which used to keep him out for extended periods of time. Apart from that, he'd play through injuries, which no other player would do. And that's probably going to be something that I'll remember about the King at Parramatta. And it's going to feel a bit strange, isn't it, to see him running around in a different jersey and maybe to listen to fans of another club maybe refer to him as the King. That's probably going to be the part that's going to sit really uncomfortably because it's really the nickname that applied to him at Parramatta. And it's just going to feel really, really odd listening to other supporters refer to him in that same way. And I'm assuming they will.
Yeah, there's while that title's obviously tied to his time at Parramatta Eel, it's only because he spent everything but 2-3 games at the start of his career as a Parramatta Eel. So that title will follow him across to St George, and it's going to sting, but that's the nature of the game, isn't it? And yeah, there's a lot of ways you can sort of turn the conversation to from here. And to be fair, the full context of what's going to play out in the wake of Gutherson leaving the Parramatta Eels is unknown. We can talk about that too, 60s. But, you know, as a celebration of what he brought to the Parramatta Eels, we did the same with Mike Acevo. But what are the iconic moments for you for the King? You know, because he started on, not through TCT, but on shaky ground via wider fans when he made his debut on the wing for the Parramatta Eels. And there was a lot of calls way back then for him to be dropped or moved on from. But he quickly found his feet from there. On that journey, which has been the better part of 10 years, what are the big moments for Parramatta's talismanic fullback for you?
You know what? It's really hard to single it out as to actually break it down to single moments, because it's really a collection of effort areas, isn't it? You can pick out certain tries, like, I recall there was a game, I think it was against St George, and it might have been at ANZ where he got the ball, I think, on his own 25, and Gutho was never renowned for what you'd call extraordinary pace, but what he had in his arsenal, especially before injuries really were taking toll, was that when he hit top pace, he could maintain top pace for an extended period of time, which is what made him the player that was so hard for other players to emulate on the training field. You know, if they were doing any sort of conditioning runs, as soon as Gutho hit the lead in any run, no one was going to be able to run him down, because he could just maintain that top pace, the top effort for an extended period of time. And in this particular game, I remember him getting a little bit of a break with I don't think it was an intercept. I think it was picking up a loose ball, or it might have been a knockdown kick. And anyway, there was some fast players in the St George side, and they just couldn't quite run him down, and he went the distance with scoring the try. And that's an early memory that I have.
It was funny
with him.
Asking that question. That was actually one of the moments that was sort of forming in my head, because I was like, yeah, it was ANZ, wasn't it? But that one, definitely, the field goal against Canberra 60s, Golden Point.
Yes.
That was a big one there too. That was a decimated Parramatta Eels lineup, I believe. And, he's not our first choice goal kicker field goal kicker in that regard, but he nailed it. But it's interesting too, because this becomes an exercise in just admiring the consistency of Clinton Gutherson, doesn't it? Where there are big moments, but then again, the worst you ever got from a Gutho was 6.5, 7, and the best was definitely above that. But probably not too similar to a player like Cooper Cronk, where such a utter professional every time they brought it, which is why their game variance was so low.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could almost probably put together a highlight reel of saved tries.
Oh yeah,
that's the thing about Gutho is, do you put together a highlight reel of try assists, because there were plenty of those? Do you put together the saved tries? Do you put together the tries that he scored? Do you put together a little montage of his Guthorinos? It's there's all of those moments, but really, John, one of the things that I've spoken about before, but it's important that I speak about now as well, is the standards that he set at training are, beyond anything that I've seen from any other player. And that's probably going to be something that will be missed. As I said, he had a capacity that few others had to be able to do things from a conditioning aspect that just left me shaking my head. Others tried to match him. I mean, Dylan Brown infamously ended up in hospital trying to go with Gutho very early on in his career. And then I think he realised, look, I just have to be my best rather than trying to be anything up near Gutho or beating Gutho. And you'd always get a young gun or two that would challenge Gutho, and there'd be the rare occasion at the start of a pre-season where someone might have got him on a run. And then you'd just see the look come over Gutho's face, and somehow in the next run, he'd find another gear. And, he'd work out, okay, well, look, I just have to go a little bit harder at the start of this run, and he won't get me, or it might just simply have been that the player concerned absolutely busted their gut with that and they couldn't emulate it, a couple of runs in a row. But seeing him do that, and then there were times when a teammate might have been struggling with some of the conditioning runs and, some of the M runs that they would do, which is basically where they would do the shape of the letter M on a field, like a zigzag running pattern. So they'd be doing sets of those, or maybe they'd keep going for a little bit longer. But where he'd go and run with a teammate that was maybe struggling. But and he's not the only person that I saw do that in terms of senior players. Tim Manor would do that. In his one pre-season with us, Josh Hodgson did that as well. And, senior players, leaders like that, they send a message about, everyone being an important member of the team, and that they're prepared to go and help players where they needed help. And, he was certainly a leader on the training track. What I'm going to miss in watching training, be it pre-season or regular season training, is the banter between him and Mitch Moses. It's something that, you talk about a memory. When they first went to relocated to Kellyville, and there was a session that Mitch Moses sat out, and it's part of what happens in pre-season. It's a little bit of load management that goes on, and someone might have a niggle, and the coaches don't push players if they've got an injury niggle during pre-season. Why would you? If it's effective for the players to sit out a session or two and maybe just be on a bike or a rowing machine or whatever the case may be, or just to rest, you'll have times like that. You don't read anything into it. Anyway, this particular day, and there was some opposed work that was going on, and I remember Moses was out, and I think from memory, Ryan Madison might have been filling in at 5'8", and when the session was over, Gutho was letting it be known to BA how good they looked without Moses at 5'8". And you knew that it was all banter, and and then they'd there was banter about goal kicking, and they'd throw percentages at each other, or if they were having a kick, you call out to the other person, look, if you watch me now, you'll learn how to kick, and things like that. So there was always something going on, and if one was on a different field to the other, you'd hear them call out to each other across the field. And it was a real genuine mateship that was there, because there was banter, but there was also plenty of time where there was a lot of love for each other out there. And of course, Gutho was always BA's general out there on the field, and his way of it was he was the conduit to the team out there on the field, to reinforce the messages out there. And I guess that's it would have been a tough year for Gutho when Brad was moved on. But the staff did say to me that Gutho's leadership found a different level. I guess with the circumstances of so many injuries and the change of coaching, that he found something else that wasn't there before. And I guess that's a measure of how Gutho's character operated, that he'd always find a way to get that extra gear in how he played the game. So look, I think it doesn't matter what happens with Gutho from here. He's already established himself as a legend player, and by that I mean a player that supporters will hold dear to their heart and remember, many years into the future. And when they talk about favourite players who've worn the jersey, he's probably going to be right up there, and rightly so, because as we've said, he was a player that never left anything in the tank, and as you pointed out, that consistency of effort, John, was just right off the scale.
It's that is very well put, and it's not directly Parramatta related. But what about his fit under Flanagan? I mean, you look back at the fullbacks that Flanagan's largely operated with, and Valentine Holmes really jumps out as the one that you would win a premiership with. I suppose there are some similarities with Michael Gordon, but it's definitely different from the fullbacks that he's been using in more modern times, isn't it? When you go from Holmes to the more recent ones in his time at St George, is this a sort of different approach from Flanagan, or is this just desperate to get a competitor to drive that new philosophy under St George?
I think you just summed it up in terms of the competitor tag that you just put onto Gutho, because that is another appropriate terminology to use with regard to him. And I think if you look at St George this year, that lack of consistency was their downfall, because it would be as if they'd have games where they'd switch off. When they were switched on, they were a hard team to overcome. But and we saw that flurry of points that they scored against us in that crazy match towards the end of the season. And I think it coincided with Gutho leaving the field, didn't it?
Yes,
that game.
we literally pulled Gutherson to just put him on ice for an extra 10 minutes, as opposed to playing him for the remainder of the game, and it sparked that manic comeback. And I suppose switching off is the real big criticism when it comes to Tyrell Sloan, isn't it? Not for talent, not for speed, which he's upper percentile on both of those things, but he could not stay in the game anywhere near 100% of the time, and that is something that certainly Clinton Gutherson does not struggle with.
Errors. And that's the thing, is that I think that Flanagan's looking for a way of keeping his team focused, of reducing errors, as a communicator out there on the field to his, to the defence line, let alone the cleaning up that Gutho would do. And I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of the Eels' defence over the years, and so you might in another instance say, well, is Parramatta's defensive record anything that you would base, Gutherson's work behind it to be, something that you'd be recruiting on the basis of? But let's face it, there was there were times where it seemed like tries were imminent and it wouldn't happen because of Gutherson. And I just think that his level of talk that's out there, the work that he does himself defensively, and keeping the team focused. I think Shane Flanagan was looking for a leader.
Mm-hmm. And that was my next question was going to go too, because Ben Hunt gone, the big domino that sort of paved the way for this Gutherson transaction to take place. Zach Lomax and Eel. Jack DeBellin's got a murky off-field sort of cloud over him from the stuff going back now. Does Gutherson walk in there and become their captain?
It's an interesting question, mate. I'd have to say he'd be in the mix. He'd have to be a strong consideration.
Yeah, I think looking at that list of players now, because Jack Bird's gone to the Tigers, right? Lomax is an Eel. Tyrell Sloan's probably not going to be in first grade. Not that he was, leadership material in the first place. Jack DeBellin, Luciano Leilua, Jaden Sewer, Francis Molo. Like, they're all solid forwards, but they don't jump out as leaders. So there is a strong chance that Gutherson walks in there with the C next to his name.
Yeah, and what can you say about it? Like, what's he been, 6-7 years as the captain at Parramatta?
2018, right, was when we installed him as one of the co-captains back then. So, yeah, 6-7 years with the C next to his name. And it's never been a matter of the credentials for on-field leadership for Gutherson, isn't it? Because he is very much actions speak louder than words kind of guy in that regard. And you literally just detailed a long list of reasons as to why, from his consistency to that defensive prowess and the never give up attitude. So, yeah, really interesting situation there on the St George side of things. And then turning our eyes back to Parramatta, which is where obviously by and large the vast majority of our focus is. The Eels now find themselves with a huge chunk of cap space for next year, and it comes back to that question of how do you use it or utilise it. The market in terms of off-contract buyers is not flush, especially given it wasn't a strong market at the start, the player transfers, but it's now well deep into that as well. So there's not like there's a absolute list of players out there to recruit, but we also know that doesn't stop clubs from working behind the scenes. Clinton Gutherson was a contract at Parramatta Eel, and now he's going to be playing for the St George Illawarra Dragons. So the reverse can be true for the Parramatta Eels. What do we do with this, mate? Do you talk about extensions and front loading? Do you talk about looking for a recruit? It's both a blessing and a curse for new coach Jason Ryles, because it's a lot of money, but what can you do to make yourself competitive with that sudden windfall of cap space?
Yeah, it is interesting, mate, because we talked about what was going to happen before Parramatta parted ways with anyone significant, and with respect to all the players that have moved on. When we're talking about parting ways with anyone significant, we're talking about Gutho, RCG, Micah Sevo for a start. They sort of head that list of players that would ultimately be moved on so far, and we say so far. But way back, before any of this was happening and looking ahead, I said that there was going to be the loss of players that fans would be uncomfortable with losing. And the reason being for that it was twofold. For Parramatta to enter the player market, they had to free up cash. Mm-hmm. They had to free up that cap space, because the players that at that early stage were departing were players that occupied more of the bottom end of the salary cap, or in other instances it was even players who were on development contracts, or those who were even outside of the top 30 in development. The people who were on train and trial deals as well that departed. So in terms of really significant money, it didn't free up a lot. And for Parramatta to would first of all have to replace those players anyway. So they're going to be looking at filling the spots with players on sort of similar deals. So you don't get, if someone goes, you have to replace them. And if someone's getting down the bottom end of the top 30 money, you're replacing them with people who will be receiving similar coin to them. So for the Eels to make recruitment decisions which go beyond that, they were always going to have to part ways with players who are on, who were up at the top end of the salary cap. And that meant finding a home for them. So you had to look at who was going to be in demand from other clubs. Well, Reg was obvious. I mean, he was the Eels Ken Thornett Player of the Year. And we saw the market respond to that. There was always a new club that seemed like they were interested before it was confirmed that he was off to the Titans. Sivo ended up with the overseas deal. And now with Gutho, he's got a club which rumours are that they're going to pay him the similar sort of money to what he was on at Parramatta. So, now you're talking about the Eels having a bit of money that they can spend. And yesterday, I put out a thing on the socials with a picture of Ben Hunt pushing over dominoes, because the first domino to fall was obviously the Dragons having the money to get Gutherson. The next domino will be any Parramatta target that they didn't have the money to sign before. Now, you and I have had names sent to us from different sources that the Eels were rumoured to be interested in. And some we put a line through straight away. Others we've had it from multiple sources and we put a little bit more credibility to it. There was some where it was obvious that, something has to happen for it before we can go pursuing that. And some of it's been in the media as well. So whether or not, and this is all speculation, this isn't coming from anyone or it's nothing that's been confirmed by Parramatta or anything like that. But do you then start talking about someone like a Ryan Papenhuyzen, for example?
I mean, it's just from the outside looking in. It's now, I know Isaiah Yongi's there and we've just signed Josh Buckley as well, but Papenhuyzen is obviously a far more senior player in that position and has a representative pedigree of talent, although there are question marks about his injury record. But also there's that connection from the Melbourne Storm with Coach Ryles as well, isn't there? And Ryles, will be looking to install his own culture into the team, and that sort of makes sense looking at that connection there. But Melbourne famously don't let players go without compensation, don't they? So it becomes a question then in this hypothetical of what do the Eels have to give away in season 2025 to acquire someone like Papenhuyzen?
Yeah, and look, when you're talking about dominoes falling, and this is and I think people are starting to get more of an appreciation about how things work in the NRL these days, that contracts are a little bit more malleable than they've ever been, especially with this November 1 stuff that goes on. So players can start negotiating with a new club to sign a year in advance. And there are players who will sign a year in advance and then continue to play with their current club and then move on when that deal is done. And, of course, you have players who sign during a season and then finish out the season, as we had with Blaze Talangi with Parramatta. So that sort of scenario can still, it unfolds. But what that November 1 situation does is clubs then start talking to each other, and agents and players are involved in this about, can we make this an early release situation that helps all of us out? So if you look at what happened with the Dragons and think about how it unfolded yesterday. So we get the news that the Dragons have immediately released Ben Hunt in the morning. And our first reaction is, here we go. It's happening. And was it any great surprise that news started filtering through about...
Almost immediately, yeah.
Yeah, you know, about what was happening with Gutho.
Meetings between his manager and the club, and you know, offer on the now officially on the table, which we know unofficially has been there for a while, going back to when the Parramatta Eels sat down with his manager Ayub and sort of brokered that expedited external negotiation process. So this has all been cooking in the background for a while. But like you said,
and it even comes back to examples that happened in the coaching front with Madge Maguire in Brisbane. If anyone thinks that, you know, within a couple of days of
they've done their due diligence,
Jimmy Walters,
and
you know, that all of a sudden Maguire's in place. It's, you know, discussions happen and things are playing out. And so as we said, Parramatta, you know, the departure of someone like Clinton Gutherson, it probably brought forward a tough conversation that may have had to have taken place, especially if injuries again struck next year. But from a perspective of what Parramatta maybe wanted to do with regard to other players, they're waiting on what happens with Gutho, which means they're waiting on whatever happens with St George, because, you know, what's happened with Ben Hunt has been simmering away for more than 12 months, and they were going to have to find space to accommodate Clint Gutherson. So you've got everyone's waiting for things to happen. Now, you've then got what's happening at other clubs. Now, let's take another rumoured player, and we don't know whether this is going to happen or not, but Jaden Brayley. You've already had the Knights in the media talking about, oh, you know, look, we don't want to part ways with Jaden Brayley, but, you know, salary cap pressure and blah, blah, blah. So they're in a hold pattern and they're waiting for things to happen. At the Storm, you've got them saying, oh, look, you know, we can only offer this much to Ryan Papenhuyzen. And so he and his agent, they want to check what's happening in the market. And, you know, all of these clubs, and it's more than just these ones that would be involved. You know, it's basically every club. Every club is looking to see what's happening with players at other clubs to determine either whether they will be able to move a player to that particular club, or whether they can secure a player from that particular club. So when you look at players who are off contract currently, it's not a true reflection of what happens in the rugby league marketplace. You literally have to go, first of all, to players who are off, who can negotiate from November 1. They come into it, but it's not always limited to that. There's players who end up getting early releases for different reasons. So there's a whole lot that plays out in the background, and knowing what's going on. I mean, look at what's happened with the Bulldogs. The Eels picked up a couple of players from the Bulldogs because they're having to look at what happens with their salary cap and their roster. And they've got young players who in Joash Papali'i and Jordan Samrani, who probably deserved to have their contracts sorted out, but the Dogs couldn't. They they're in the process of needing to have a bit of cap space freed up themselves. So the Eels were able to swoop there and swoop effectively and immediately. But, there's a whole lot that's playing out right now. And maybe, just maybe, this Ben Hunt situation, it's toppled the first domino. It might have a couple more that follow, ones that impact what happens at Parramatta.
Mm-hmm.
It is a case of watch this space. And let's not forget that preseason training starts on Monday for the first players that return. I think some of the senior players like Gutho were slated to return more the middle of the month. And then, of course, there are players who are in the Pacific Championships who we mightn't see until January. But teams are returning to pre-season. Nobody wants someone starting a pre-season and then moving on. So I think the action's going to hot up over the next couple of weeks. And it'll be interesting to see where it leads to. So we say that watch this space. I think there's going to be a lot of entertainment value in the rugby league marketplace. The media is going to have a field day on certain days. And it's not just going to involve Parramatta. It's going to involve a few clubs. So we're most interested in Parramatta, but it's going to give us plenty to talk about in the podcast, mate.
Yes, it's going to be probably an action-packed relatively to the off-season sort of couple of weeks moving forwards because, like you said, pre-season kicks off. Clubs are going to want these contractual sort of misnomers sorted out as soon as possible if there is going to be movement. But going back to like that whole centre shuffle that led to the Eels getting Michael Jennings back in 2015, that happened closer to Christmas, didn't it? I think.
I think that was when was it? 2017 that we got Michael Jennings? Or 2016?
Maybe
2016, anyway, I don't think it wasn't 20.
No, 2015 was too early on the timeline. Yeah, so 20.
Yeah, but yes, it was, and to be fair as well, and this is a funny story that we heard through a source that was connected with Michael Jennings' family that he'd signed a deal with Parramatta, and there was a group of us from TCT that went down to Old Sale Yards training, and there was a couple of players that were on the exercise bike on the training on the running track that we used to watch from, and one of those players was Danny Wicks. The other was one of the younger players who was on a train and trial, and I went up to Danny as I walked past him. I said, "Are you going to have a new face here at training pretty soon?" And he said, "Well, who's that?" And I said, "Michael Jennings." And he laughed and said, "Someone's having a lend of you, mate." And I said, "No, it's something that's happening. It's he's going to be here." And he said, "No, that's bullshit, mate. That's not happening." And Mitch, who was who had been the person who'd got that information, I said to him, "Come here, Mitch." And I said, "This is the fellow who's got the mail." And Danny was like, "I'll tell you what I'll do. I bet you $50 he doesn't end up here." And we just said, "Oh, we don't want to take your money." And he goes, No, we'll have the bet." And anyway, of course, within a day or two, the news came out about Michael Jennings joining the Eels. And let's just say that Danny Wicks wasn't too impressed with losing the bet. But it's an example of how the players within the organisation, they don't necessarily know what's going on, especially when it comes to recruitment, because they're focused on what they need to get done. And, they've got their mates in the club, and maybe they might know a little bit about what their mates might be thinking. But in terms of people joining the club, they're probably in the dark as much as any supporter might be. So, it's interesting times. The players are going to be starting their pre-season. As I wrote about in that open letter to the squad, it's a new dawn for them because they're going to have so many new faces that will be joining them. And and of course, all the players that are new to the club, as is always the case, they're having to create their new bonds and, get close to different players. There might be one or two that they might have been familiar with or might have been, they might know through junior representative football, or maybe they've crossed paths at different times in the past. But it's a new start for a lot of them. It's a whole new crew of coaches that are there. And when you've got still so much going on, you hope that it's going to be sorted before we're too deep into the pre-season. So, John, just wrapping things up, I think when it comes to those dominoes, whether those dominoes fall for next year or the year after then becomes the question. So let's take an example of Papenhuyzen, and we're not saying that, Papenhuyzen ends up at Parramatta or what have you, but his is probably the ideal example that we could use with this. So he's at the point where he's looking at testing the market. Now, let's say, for example, that he receives an offer from a club. Let's say that club is Parramatta. And the Storm, however, aren't open to an early release. And let's say Papenhuyzen is also quite happy to play out the last year of his deal at Melbourne Storm. It means he's not available to take into a roster, be it at Parramatta or anywhere else, until 2026. The decision then for a club like Parramatta is, do they look at signing someone under those circumstances and then use the money in some sort of stopgap way for 2025? And there's ways that they can, that sort of money can be used within a roster, and then it can still be available the following year in terms of recruitment, because you have to spend 95% of your salary cap in any given year. So do the Eels then use that money in some sort of a temporary way in 2025 and then hit major targets for 2026? Or do they go all out to get targets in 2025, and that's where the falling dominoes come into place? Because, as I said, and as we've acknowledged, John, the player availability market, those that are off contract now for next year, it's a little bit thin on the ground in terms of high profile recruits. So it's either dominoes fall immediately and you're able to get someone for 2025, or they don't fall immediately and you have to be prepared to tread water. And maybe tread water is the wrong term, not tread water in terms of what you want to achieve with a team in a premiership in a given year, but in terms of how you spend the money. You look at spending it in different ways and keeping some powder dry for 12 months down the track. And I think that's probably where the Eels are at. Now, do we think the Eels are going to be better off or worse off with these recent contract decisions? I think we're obviously going down a different direction, John. The Reg one, I think that's probably been the toughest decision. Would you, like, in terms of immediate playing form and and where a player's at in terms of health and form, that sort of stuff, would you say that would have been the toughest decision?
Yeah, look, Reg still has a good year or two of strong football in the tank, I think, and the Eels are probably a little bit skinny in the middle, like not skinny middle forwards, because we do have a lot of middle forwards, but forwards that fit Reg's archetype, it probably hurts us a lot now. So that's fair.
Well, as Bernie did say when we put the question to him, how do you replace Reg? And he said, well, you don't.
Yeah.
You know, like there
the
isn't another RCG type player out there.
The way I suppose you spin's probably is the right word here. Is that not too dissimilar to how Gutherson was at least partially moved on under the mandate of trying to inject more speed into the back line and bringing the Eels into the modern metagame like that. You could argue that Reg being moved on paves the way for the Eels to get smaller and more mobile in the forward pack. Now, whether that's the correct conclusion to draw from it remains to be seen, because intuitively getting more speed into the back line seems easier and more straightforward than making that transition to that lighter mobile forward pack that is also effective in the middle. But I'll in that vein, I would argue that, Reg is probably the biggest pure loss in a positional basis, although we are entrusting now our fullback position to a couple of rookies in Isaiah Yongi and Joash Papali'i.
Yeah, so we have to understand that the roster is being reshaped. And look, we've used this term, we've talked about it nonstop. I think fans understand that it is going through a reshaping. And there are obviously differing opinions on who supporters would prefer to have parted ways with in terms of either the form of the player, and by that I'm talking about Reg being the Ken Thornett Player of the Year and having he was one of the mainstays of the team in 2024. He played all games. He was some of his strongest form, certainly in the back half of the season. And Gutherson just being Gutho. And there's not only, was there the consistency of performance, there was the emotional ties that Eels supporters felt towards Gutho. So people might argue, no, look, Gutho was the toughest departure. I think there's also a lot of people out there with who can be pragmatic and go, you know what, Gutho might have had another year in him and he would have had a lot of value for next year. We shouldn't be parting ways with him. But I think there was an inevitability about how long Gutho had left at his best. And it's just really moved a difficult conversation out of the way next year by another club stepping in and saying, look, we think he's got value for us in where we're at. And you know what? Someone had to find value in Gutho, because you just don't. I've spoken about so much over the years that Gutho's market value may not have ever matched what Parramatta has been prepared to offer him, because, clubs like their fast, elusive fullbacks, Parramatta's had someone who was in a different mould in Gutho, someone who was, it wasn't that Gutho was slow or anything like that. He was like, if you can use the term, a workhorse fullback. He contributed as much defensively as he would in attack. He'd contribute as much with his leadership as he would in being just a key member in the team. He offered a lot of intangibles to the Parramatta Eels that made him just about $1 million player with the club. But was he $1 million player out there in the marketplace? And there had to be a club that was interested in him. It turned out that it was the Dragons. I'm not sure that it was too many other clubs, but I'm actually happy for him that he can continue his career and that we don't end up with having to have a tough conversation with a player who's a legend of the club. And so when it comes to these players, John, and whether we're going to be worse off or better off for the decisions that are being made, it comes down to how players perform that come in place of them. And you can't replace who Regan Campbell-Gillard was as a player. So you look at, as you just suggested, the game is changing. Someone, faster, mobile that comes in, and we take how we play in a different direction. Same really with Gutherson. You're not going to find another Clint Gutherson out there. There isn't anyone that plays the game like him at fullback. So your game goes into a different direction. We end up with someone who's maybe more attack-based, someone who is a different sort of threat to the Eels' attack. Micah Sevo. You're going to find another Micah Sevo out there? Probably not. But, Micah's form wasn't as consistent as Gutho and Reg. Micah gave us a hell of a lot of highlights, an awful lot of highlights, and he's dearly loved, and that Sevo chant will be forever in Eels folklore. But he's also on the wrong side of 30. And again, the game is changing. Are we after one of those more athletic wingers now? Will that be a target? As things stand, do we have someone that we've recruited as a winger to come in? Well, Zach Lomax, if he plays wing, but there might be a chance that Zach Lomax plays centre. If you say it, but if you look at that as Sevo out, Lomax in, if you look at the 2024 form, you say, okay, the Eels are ahead. They've got a different type of winger, but he's a winger who's had the best season of his career and is the current state of origin and Australian winger. Can you complain about that? No, you can't. So there's going to be an element of unknown about next season. People have to realise the roster's not finished. There's 5 spots still to be filled. So 3 of which have to be filled before round 1 next year. So there is going to be movement. When it happens, I don't know. But I think we are going to definitely have a better year than last year. The only thing that would make it worse would be if injuries struck just as badly as they have in the last couple of years. And you can't possibly imagine, I'm touching wood right now, you can't possibly imagine the key injuries that we had in 2023 and 2024 happening again in 2025. So
surely not.
Surely not. So look, I think that's where we're at the moment, John. There's probably not too much more we can add to this special edition of the podcast, an instant reaction edition of the podcast. I mean, what are we going to put this up as? Instant reaction or special edition? I guess special edition, because instant reaction goes more to a game just happening. But mate, is there anything more you want to add at this stage?
No, I mean, it's absolutely now the end of an era. Brad Arthur moved on, Clinton Gutherson moved on, Regan Campbell-Gillard, Micah Sevo joining them as well. So, it's a bittersweet sort of feeling, isn't it, where we close the books on a very storied era of Parramatta football. Went to the grand final in 22, being one of the more consistent teams for the better part of half a decade. And we now venture into the bold, but also, kind of scary when it comes to change, new era under Coach Ryles. And I'm excited to see what we can do with the injection of youth, of speed, and the risks that there come with, moving on from the senior players that we have. And maybe it's going to be a rocky start. Maybe we trip and stumble. Maybe we burst out the blocks. Who knows? But it's new, it's exciting, and we get to plot a new journey. So we'll be there as TCT along every step of the way, and hopefully everyone can join us on that journey. But yeah,
in our 10th year, mate. In our 10th
year. So the stars have aligned in a, I wouldn't say fortuitous manner, but in a coincidental manner at least. And yeah, like I said, I hope everyone can join us on this journey because it's going to be exciting. And maybe it's tough, maybe it's easy, who knows? But that's the joy of going into the great unknown now. So just really keen to see some football next year.
Well, mate, the excitement starts early for me. Fortunately, preseason's commences on Monday, and although that's just the early returnees, it's not some of the senior players, but it all kicks off next week. Preseason training reports coming your way on TCT. We'll still look to have our news edition of the podcast put together tomorrow. Who knows, with the way things are unfolding, it could well be necessary anyway to have a news podcast tomorrow. But for now, this is the conclusion of our special edition reaction to Clint Gutherson news. Thank you to everyone who's had a listen to it. Thank you to the huge numbers of people that have stayed with TCT in the off season. We'll talk more about the site visits during this month, but it's been tremendous to see the people that have been responding to the content on the Cumberland Throw during October, a month where there just wasn't any Parramatta action happening in terms of finals football or anything in that regard. It's still been quite an interesting month for us to be providing content for everyone. Thank you to our sponsors, Star Partners Real Estate, Auburn, Narellan and Parramatta. Exciting year coming up for them to be again on board with TCT. Also a reminder, please make sure that you vote, and we'll put that reminder in our news podcast. But for the EGM for Parramatta Leagues Club, please make sure that you vote. And as we've done, we're voting against the resolutions. We won't going to spend time going into that right now, but just don't assume everything's okay without your vote. Your vote counts, and we've all voted against the resolutions. All 5. Make sure that you do as well. John, thank you. And as I always say, go you mighty Eels.